Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for one of our Empowered Spoonies chats. We are hosting the event today, Mobility in Today's Society, in honor of Mobility Awareness Month. And today I am proud to be a part of this talk with everybody from VisitAble. So VisitAble is here to kind of introduce us what mobility awareness is and how they are a part of this community. And today I am joined by Joe and Corey from VisitAble. Joe, thank you so much for being here. And Corey, thank you so much for being here. I'll let you all introduce yourselves today.
Great. Thanks so much for having us. We're really excited for this conversation. So my name is Joe. I'm the CEO and founder of VisitAble. We're really an organization enabling a better experience for visitors with mobility challenges for any public-facing spaces.
My name is Corey Parody. I'm an advisor for VisitAble. I'm also a certified ADA coordinator, and I currently work for the University of Virginia Facilities Management Department as well.
Awesome, Corey. Thank you. So, and before we kind of dabble into what today's event is all about, I would love to kind of get to know your organization and have our Empowered Spoonies also get to know a little bit more about VisitAble.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'll go in with, starting what my motivation started and how VisitAble really started. So basically my passion really started because my father has used a wheelchair for my entire life. I grew up learning about accessibility, from a very early age, as early as I can remember, and really developing an awareness for some of the barriers and issues that people with mobility challenges face on a daily basis. I went to school at UVA and took the entrepreneurship minor. The capstone course was create your own business. Lo and behold, I'm still working on it. They asked you to pick something you're passionate about, and the answer was clear to me, right? It's doing what I had experience with, what I've learned a lot about. And I decided really to focus on two main concerns of mine, or things that I was passionate about. One being the fact that there's this natural gap between ADA compliance and what is actually and practically accessible to those with mobility issues. I usually illustrate this point with three shortcomings in the ADA. I talk a lot about some of the enforcement system of the ADA being based mostly off complaints has really led to a reactive and a punitive approach in today's society. Both public and private organizations are really, waiting for a complaint, waiting for a new facility to be built, or waiting for a facility to be renovated to even consider accessibility. Also, there are potential loopholes or lacks of clarity in the ADA with verbiage such as program access, preservation of historical features, etc. And finally, certain guidelines that aren't in the ADA, such as how to treat people with disabilities or what signage could really improve the user experience in a physical space and how to navigate it. And in reality, in my experience with my father, I listened to him calling ahead because you never knew how accessible places were. He would have to talk to someone would answer that didn't really know what accessibility meant, which often led to a couple scenarios, right? You either talk to someone, like 4 or 5 different people before you finally get an answer. You're told inaccurate information such as, hey, yeah, we're completely wheelchair accessible. And we'll show up and there will be a step or two and there will be like, oh, well, it's only a step or two, right? I'm like, nope, that's not accessible. And sometimes they'll ask, they'll go, ask my father to go deep into a situation about his disability, his needs and conditions. And the process was more or less, uncomfortable, tedious, inefficient, inaccurate, right? And this really led to a barrier of uncertainty where it was like we're either going to the same places that we know are accessible and welcoming, or we're staying at home and ordering takeout or whatever the case is. And really, even if a place is completely accessible, that's no guarantee that people with disabilities will be treated the same as their non-disabled counterparts. And that's a second problem I really wanted to focus on with VisitAble was the mistreatment of people with disabilities. I always give the example of going to a restaurant with my father and having the host or hostess talk with me the whole time and not really acknowledge his presence. So, that leaves a bad taste in your mouth. You don't want to go back to these places. And I decided I'd do something about it. So I started Visible to really pick up where the law falls short and help bridge this gap between the minimum ADA compliance and what is practically accessible. We really wanted to create a training certification process to improve access, awareness, and knowledge around what accessibility is and how to be mobility friendly, how to treat people the correct way, as well as creating a database where people can navigate how accessible places are and which places have been trained on disability etiquette. And here we are, we're in Charlottesville from our founding at UVA. We've had about 32 businesses sign up for the training certification process and very recently 2 local governments we're really excited about. And we're really looking forward to growing and continuing our relationship with IMW.
Awesome. Us too as well. And you hit on some really good key points. Certain things that have even happened to me. I have been part of the disability community as a disabled person and before I became disabled. As you know, invisible disabilities are something that are, as they say, invisible. So once you start using mobility aids is when people actually start to notice that you have actually had it. And that's when, like, I would say the ableism kind of gets a little bit better. I know it sounds really weird because your invisible disability becomes more visible. But I was part of the disability department. I used to volunteer there. I used to be a note taker for school. And one of my best friends has CP and has been in a wheelchair of different types. And the same thing happened to you, happened to me. The waitress did not acknowledge my friend whatsoever. Yet we were there for a couple of hours ordering, having fun, and it left a bad taste in our mouth as well. So I'm glad that you have made this kind of like your passion project also in a way for bringing awareness. So when I ask this question is, why is mobility important for the disability community? I know that's a very bit of a broad and trick question, but I would love to see how VisitAble comes into play with that.
Yeah, well, I'd love to.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that one.
Let Corey take it.
So I forgot to mention in the intro, but I myself also have cerebral palsy, and so I've used a wheelchair most of my life. And mobility is really important within the disability community because I see it, mobility is kind of access to the world, access to life, access to opportunities, access to employment. So, up until, through the 80s mostly, a lot of people with disabilities, particularly mobility challenges, had to stay home because they couldn't access schools, libraries, restaurants, bowling alleys, movie theaters, etc. So the more we can kind of promote access and mobility inclusion, the more people with disabilities can fully participate in society.
Yeah, I think those are great points. If I had to add anything, I really think that, being able to get around in different like social aspects of life, having the same opportunities as everyone else. I think, it's about time. The ADA has been around since 1990. Before that, it was kind of abysmal, right? And now's the time where people, I feel like, should be getting out in society and having the same opportunities, whether that be to housing, education, local government programming, or just, public accommodation with, movie theaters or whatever the case is. I want to experience everything, with my dad as everyone else did. And something passionate about me that I don't really talk about that much is, I grew up in the Boy Scouts, and we went to different campgrounds and different facilities for different events. And, my father wasn't able to participate like other fathers. And it really like made an impact on me, right? It's like, why is recreation and different like things that are really fun for everyone? Why can't mobility be an important part of these aspects, right? And that really left an impact on me, I think.
Oh, actually, now that you say that, it's so strange because now that I am using more and more my mobility aids every day, with the fluctuation of invisible disabilities. 1 minute you could be using a cane, 1 minute you could be using a walker, 1 minute you could be using a wheelchair. So it changes. And I've had people see me get out of my car because I have my handicap pass on and berate me for having one in the first place. I go to, for example, I went to the park recently. There's a park behind our school that we were trying to do some more improvements as part of the student government. And unfortunately, it's not accessible whatsoever, yet it's a beautiful park. And I feel left out, like I'm not able to enjoy that same in scenery or environment that all my colleagues are able to enjoy at the college, because it's just not accessible. And because the college is on a state property, we're part of a state college, apparently that small park is actually not even part of the school, so the school can't do anything about it. So when you say that, I think that those changes, especially like what VisitAble is doing statewide or local wide or university wide, I hope that we can see that expand to other colleges, to other state institutions as well. So one question is, and this is like something that not a lot of people know, there's so many different types of mobility aids nowadays. So what is considered a mobility aid, really?
You okay with taking the first stab at this?
Yeah. So from my perspective, mobility aid is something that assists people in movement throughout their day-to-day life. In my case, it's a wheelchair. There's canes, walkers, things like that kind of just assist people in moving around from their day-to-day life.
Yeah, definitely. I think I want to go a little deeper into mobility aids and really talk about some of the conversations we've had, Michelle and I, one of which is being shown right now. It's, a lot of people consider mobility aids, something that, isn't liberation, right? Like this is helping you access life. This isn't something that's constraining what you can do. And the other thing is it's a part of a person. It's part of a person's personal space. You shouldn't be going up to someone and pushing their wheelchair or like trying to help someone like, put a wheelchair in a car or whatever. Everyone has their own processes, what they're comfortable with. And you never should assume anything. You never should assume someone needs help with something or, that it's okay to touch someone. Like you want to touch an able-bodied person, push them up a hill if they're moving slower or whatever. And I think the same thing applies to mobility aids. This is part of a person.
Yeah, and there's something I wanted to add to that as well. One of my favorite terms that I use as someone in a wheelchair is wheelchair enabled, right? The wheelchair enables me to live my life. It's not something that I'm stuck in. It's not a hindrance. It's not something that should be seen as a negative thing. It's something that helps, improve the lives of people. So, yeah, when we talk about language a little bit, like wheelchair bound or something, like those sorts of kind of negative connotations, trying to get away from kind of a negative connotation associated with any sort of mobility aid. So
yeah, I think verbiage is very important to consider. And the last thing, I think sometimes there's new adaptive products coming out that help people become more mobile or increase their mobility. And I think we've seen that a lot with, personal electronic vehicles, I believe is the correct term. And that's something that we're trying to educate ourselves on. But some of the, Parks and Recreation departments we talk to are kind of like considering like, is this something that we should allow in our park? Is this something that would be allowed on trails? And we're all for it. If it increases someone's mobility and independence, we think that it should be allowed.
I absolutely agree. So there's so many different possibilities that could work for anybody that has a mobility aid. Or now, but Corey, you mentioned something that kind of came to mind. Have you ever heard any ableist words that you think that should be no-nos in this day's community when it comes to mobility aids?
I don't know if they're specifically like mobility aid questions, but or related, but wheelchair bound, kind of referring to people as their mobility aid, like the the wheelchair person or the wheelchair guy or whatever.
Yeah. Confined, like a wheelchair confined is another one.
Yeah.
And just like sometimes, like referring to someone by their mobility device instead of a person, right? Like that's extremely offensive.
Yeah. Person first language is super critical in this instance as well. Like I don't like the term disabled person, for example. It's person with a disability or person with a mobility challenge or something like that.
And I think different communities within the disabled community treat person first versus identity first in a different manner. But I think, people won't be offended necessarily if you're trying to be polite and use person first language.
Right.
So how would you kind of say the ADA, you mentioned that in our conversation. And for those that don't know what ADA stands for, it's the American Disability Act. It was made almost I would say it's coming up on its 31st anniversary, right? Yeah, very soon. You would think it would be out that much longer, but unfortunately it hasn't. But it is still what we call the baby of advocacy regarding disability. But there are things that can be improved, even though that it's been around for 30 years. What would you say can be improved to help people with mobility challenges?
Sure.
Let's get the ADA coordinator going.
So you touched on kind of what it is, but yeah, it's basically just a civil rights law that was passed in 1990 to promote equality and equity for people with disabilities in various aspects of life, from employment to the built environment to communications. So it's kind of an all-encompassing kind of civil rights law, piece of legislation. But you're exactly right. It's kind of just the minimum, if you will, of accessibility and mobility. A couple points Joe already touched on earlier, but just in terms of improvement, like the ADA doesn't really discuss or mention like treatment of people with disabilities, like how to interact with people. You think like, treat others how you want to be treated type of thing. And yet there's so many instances where like people with disabilities are either ignored or talked down to or like patronized for doing like day-to-day things like so that's one area of improvement that I think the ADA could build on or add in is kind of an etiquette aspect of it as in addition to the other areas already covered. Secondly, I would say, again, Joe already mentioned this as well, but a more proactive approach to enforcement rather than a reactive approach. So many improvements, especially within existing buildings or existing environments, are complaint-based rather than, being more proactive and maybe trying to incentivize improvement on behalf of, local businesses or governments or whatever the entity may be. So trying to be more proactive and getting out in front of kind of what obstacles may be present in the built environment rather than waiting for somebody to like complain and say, hey, why isn't this accessible? Those are two things that come to mind off the top of my head. But Joe, if you want to jump in and add some more.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing that Corey and I like talk about always is like the third point I'd mentioned in my intro was like some guidelines that aren't in the ADA, which are important to the disabled community. One of the most important ones being how to treat people. But there are some like, physical like potential guidelines in terms of a physical space to make it more user friendly that aren't in the ADA. I think some interesting ones, I think Corey might know more of them than I do. But I think one of the interesting ones we talked about was the bed height in hotels.
Mm-hmm.
I talked, I think, a little bit about signage and how to navigate spaces. Um,
So just kind of going in depth a little bit more with those. So many instances I've been in hotel rooms or just different kind of transient lodging facilities, if you will, as the ADA refers to them. And there's really there's no dimensions for what the bed height should be. So I've been in hotel rooms where the, bed is 30 inches off the floor, right? And it's like, well, how am I supposed to, get myself into bed in the evening? The typical wheelchair seat height is about, I don't know, 16, 17 inches. So you're talking about a difference of, a foot to a foot and a half. So that's one specific example. Another one that I've encountered a lot has to do with showers. Like the shower heads, for example, they're supposed to be on like a pole that can go up and down, adjustable height shower head. And more often than not, even if
the one on the top.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
It's all the way at the top. So it's like, even if it is an accessible shower, like it's not really left in an accessible condition, if that makes sense. So all sorts of different things that can be kind of built on and improved upon.
Yeah. And I think another one we mentioned was the percentage, right, of different things. Like we talked about this, like 1 in 7 people have a mobility challenge, according to the CDC. 1 in 4 people have disabilities, according to the CDC. And what's the requirement for parking? Like 1 in 100 or something like that?
It's a very small percentage.
That doesn't match. Like the percentage of accessible rooms in hotels, right? It's not anywhere near.
It's like, the requirement's like 5% of rooms have to be accessible. And we're talking about, close to 20% of the population that has a mobility challenge or a mobility disability. So the percentages aren't really proportionate to what to reflect society.
Yeah. And we think that like in a lot of areas too, with like recreation and some of the cutting edge, like fun things, right? There's not that many standards about it. Like we had to look into Architectural Barriers Act instead of the ADA to find out more things. And even then, like there's actually a lot of organizations out there doing great work in these areas, but they're not in the ADA. They're not like required by law. There's, from the complaint enforcement system, the ADA, to absolutely zero enforcement system, right? Like just these suggestions. I think there's a lot of improvement for, allowing access and independence and these like, fun areas of life. And you even talked about going to parties and house parties.
Like they don't address, the ADA doesn't address like private residences. So it kind of limits social opportunity. Like if a friend of mine is having a birthday party or whatever the case may be, if their house or place of residence isn't accessible, I'm not able to participate in that event or that occasion. So it kind of limits social opportunity as well. And we also talked about like Airbnb and VRBO type companies and places where individuals, rent out their houses to people. And as far as I know, they're not required by any ADA standard, to make their residences accessible. So it limits places like when I travel, those sorts of companies or businesses or business models, as far as places to stay, are not available. So
and even step further. I'm sorry, we're going on for this forever. This might
No, it's fine.
Even in the information side of the Airbnb and VRBO, and even with like even businesses with Google and Yelp, a lot of it is self-reported by the businesses or the homeowners. And a lot of times it's really inaccurate information. I can't remember the amount of times I've seen like wheelchair accessible, and there'll be like a flight of stairs like going up to the entrance, and it's like, oh, okay. How do you not know what that's not wheelchair accessible?
Well, and I think that organizations like yourself, like VisitAble, is making that change happen. Like, I don't think that people, when they go apply for a license for a business, are being given a guide or any sort and saying like, hey, just to let you know, your business needs to be compliant with the ADA. It's a second, it should be not a second thought or an afterthought. It should be like the package that comes with. Like, before you're getting into a business, this is the things you need to do before you even open your door. It shouldn't be an afterthought, kind of like what Corey said. It should be proactive. And one thing that I keep seeing around is that a lot of the disability buttons that where you touch TV, even open the door, they don't work. And after so many times that you complain about it or you try to address it, I don't know why. This is something that I'm internally dealing with, is that I feel bad. I feel like I'm the one that's going, oh, like, oops, I shouldn't have said that. Maybe I shouldn't have brought it up. I'm bothering them. And then it shouldn't be that way. So this is where I asked this question, like, how can we be an advocate, even if you're not disabled, or if you have a family member? How can you bring this attention, what to look for, you know, we deal every day, like, for example, our malls. This is something that I deal with. The mall that we have in town has two parking spaces for disabled. That's it. And it's a huge mall. And you're looking around, you're like, do I just have to go to a different store to park in front of that store, even though the store that I want to is right here that I could walk to if you just had two more spaces? And this is the type of stuff. And then the other thing that I'm as an advocate, I get hindered by is, how do you find the person to actually talk to about that? And a lot of the times they just and then the next day it's really no change. So how do you recommend that we advocate for this type of situation, or what to look out for, so we can be a little bit more assisted in the community?
So I'll take a first stab at this. The biggest thing I would say is, education, because there is kind of an educational gap. Like, the general community may or may not know, about the ADA or about accessibility. So just trying to educate people as much as possible on what accessibility is, kind of, maybe the 10 most common, accessibility shortfalls or barriers, just kind of raising awareness. So kind of goes back to, being treated a little differently. The best thing, or one of the best things you could do, is just talk to somebody with a disability. Be curious, ask questions, like, you can maybe approach them and say, do you mind if I ask you a question about this or that? Just any way that you can kind of educate yourself or help educate others is extremely beneficial, just in terms of, advocating and improving accessibility overall.
Yeah. I think one thing I really want to touch on that's also important is just making yourself seen and heard. I think is kind of overlapping with your point. Sometimes people need to know why accessibility is important. Like they need to know, hey, 1 in 7 people have mobility challenges. 1 in 4 people have disabilities. In this capitalist society, sometimes you have to make it, very transparent. 1 in 4 of your customer market has disabilities. You need to treat them the right way, right? It's important. People don't know like what they're missing out on. It's like educating them about not only, how to be accessible and how to be, polite and respectful when you interact with someone, but also why is it important to, make this structural change in your organization and implement policies, right? I think that there's one cycle I keep seeing, the cycle of inaccessibility. I think we've talked about it. Is, before the ADA was built, there were inaccessible like buildings and facilities built. And then, with the, exception of historical preservation, it wasn't like necessarily like prioritized to, retrofit these. And people with disabilities weren't able to access these buildings or facilities. And then after that, like basically people with disabilities weren't seen, right? They weren't seen by the decision makers. They weren't seen by bystanders or employees or whatever the case is. And subsequently they weren't, put into the decision-making process, the iterative design, and it just remains inaccessible. And unfortunately, that's kind of the concern. I've had, when I reach out to businesses, sometimes they're like, well, this isn't a problem. Like, we've never had a problem. And I was like, maybe like the problem is that you don't have a problem. Like, maybe the problem is that you're not having enough people like with mobility challenges that are seeing this. And it's really, broadcasting information, making a stance, like trying to be proactive about it. And you'll never know really without like people need to, like, they need to see and hear people with disabilities. Right. And or like make an impact.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, kind of going off of that point a little bit. Bless you.
Bless you.
Yeah, like, we've never had an issue with mobility here. Nobody's ever said anything. That may be because people with disabilities can't access your business or, in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course you're not going to have an issue. So, business owners, just people in general, community members, if they have boards, where decisions are made, just trying to involve kind of as many different people from as many different backgrounds as possible, speaks to a larger, kind of inclusivity movement as well, but involving people with disabilities in decisions and, letting them have a seat at the table more or less, will really goes a long way.
Yeah. You need to talk to the decision makers. I think that's a big point. Yeah. Get in front of the board, that what's called school board, or, the town council, city council, county board of supervisors, get in front of them and let them make sure you're heard and where access can be better.
I always say this: an advocate's voice is very important, but unless the advocate speaks up, there's no voice to be heard. So I can't emphasize enough how much self-advocacy is so important. And that's what IMW kind of stands for, is like, we empower our community. We empower the Spoonie community. We empower those that are invisible or visible disabilities to be able to be comfortable to speak up and be able to advocate for themselves. So if that is regarding mobility or doctors, we always make sure that you're empowered enough to do so, because your voice does matter. Exactly. And then I would love to kind of show something or share something with everybody here. We had this up earlier. A mobility aid is not just one thing. There's so many different mobility aids. There's wheelchairs, electric vehicles, the crutches, the walkers, the canes. There's so many different kinds. So remember that mobility aids, as we said, is not a hindrance. It's an asset to mobility, an asset for living. So those that with mobility aids don't feel like we are a hindrance or feel that we are bothering you, make sure that the way that you're directing it to a person that has mobility aid is the proper way of doing so. So first and foremost, we do have a couple of questions from some of our members and some that we received on Instagram about the event. First is, what kind of certification programs do you offer? And that was one of the questions that we had. So what you had future plans for VisitAble, but we want to like to know, like, what kind of plans do you have and what exactly does the certification program come into play?
Yeah, I that's a great question. I actually was just going to talk about how we want to involve people, going back to making people with disabilities heard and encouraging self-advocacy. So that this is a good point to talk about that and how we, incorporate that in our certification. So currently we're starting out with a training certification, and it's more geared towards mobility, However, it's basically 4 phases. And in the first phase is a training on disability etiquette, which can either be in person or a virtual e-learning module. And we really try to cover important topics for all disabilities and chronic illnesses in that training. The next phase, we have an accessibility assessment, which is not an ADA compliance assessment. It's very focused right now on practical mobility access. And we also include a secret shopper experience by someone with a mobility challenge to test how they're treated, because we think that's an important part of inclusion. And that should be something that should be tested as well. And it gives the organization a chance to put their training into practice, and really, in a positive way, in a helpful way, right? And the next step is to have a report and spreading this awareness, right? Making the business or organization or facility aware of their practical mobility access, giving them the feedback from the secret shopper or Mr. Guest, giving them showing them where their strong points are and where their areas of opportunity are, and giving them suggestions on how to improve, letting them know that about the resources out there, making it that much easier for them to become aware and make that improvement. And finally, we use that information from the accessibility test and secret shopper experience to create a listing on our database of mobility information that's standardized and reliant and consistent. And basically the phases 2 and 3 are mobility specific at this point. But we want those, and we're aiming a goal for this summer to have it by August or September, to be able to expand those 2 specific phases to all disabilities and chronic illnesses. And we'd love to engage INW in that. But the 4th phase is the just certification deliverables. So basically, we're acknowledging through our training certification, by going through this process, that an entity has been trained by us on disability etiquette, that they've engaged the feedback of the disability community through the secret shopper, that they've become aware of the mobility access through our report, and that they're being transparent about their accessibility. And that's currently our training certification. And I talked a little bit about our future plans, but we definitely want to be inclusive as possible of all disabilities and chronic illnesses. In this early stage, we just wanted to make sure the proof of concept was there, and make sure that we're being trying to be comfortable with what we are knowledgeable in, and then we're getting to a point where we can engage more people and be able to incorporate everything, right? Hopefully. And ultimately, we want to create something that really indicates a level of accessibility, because right now our certification does not indicate a level of accessibility. It really indicates those 4 things I mentioned before. So I think hopefully I covered that, but I can go more into detail about anything if that's helpful.
Yeah, that was great, Joe. Thank you. And the one question that we have from the audience today, additional to this, is when somebody shows up to an ADA compliant location, and unfortunately it's not ADA compliant any longer, how can we approach this? Who do we contact? Is it more the business owner, or is it a local municipality administrator? How do we go about making the change?
Right. So I would say it's a little bit of both. It kind of goes back to who can you get to listen to you kind of thing. If it's a local government building, then reach out to the city or the county to kind of see what can be improved and how to improve it. If it's a private business, speaking to the business owner, or whoever might own that a place of business, to see about getting because there's program access, and then there's also access to goods and services. So there's a couple different solutions there. Not every business or building is going to have the financial means to make a place accessible, unfortunately, for various reasons. So if, for example, I go to a bookstore, and there's steps to get into the bookstore, right? I could have somebody that works in the bookstore, come out and, ask me some questions about maybe the types of books that I'm interested in. They might go into the store, pick out a few, have me look at them, kind of thing. And so essentially, there's access to the same services without actually having to go into the building itself. I do realize it's not always the most practical or reasonable thing to do. But unfortunately, in some instances, like I said, some businesses don't really have the financial means right away to address physical barriers. But yeah, just going back to, making the business owner aware, like, hey, there's a problem here. Getting the city or locality involved, if at all possible, and just trying to speak up, and bring light to whatever the obstacle or mobility challenge is.
I have a couple of thoughts as well. One, I think Corey was really describing interim solutions, right? Like even governments have something called like transition plans where, 10 years down the road, right, they'll have an elevator in and that's ADA compliant technically, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like as long as you have that plan. But what can you do in the meantime? And in their case, like they could claim program access. So maybe one building, they have planned 10 years down the road to have an elevator, but they can access the programming in a different building that has an elevator. But what about people that want to access that building, right?
Mm-hmm.
Providing interim solutions, like what can you do in the meantime? What can you do with, customer service to mitigate physical barriers? Like such as if there's an inaccessible part of a tour, having some type of like tablet where you can see what's happening. Obviously it's not ideal, but it's really just trying to do as much as you can given your current resources. And secondly, I wanted to point out, there are local organizations across the U.S. called Centers for Independent Living that are there for people with disabilities. They're, I think, required to have 51% of their staff be persons with disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And they help people through these concerns, and they're always there for people, and they're really take them under their wings and help them work through these problems. And lastly, and I guess I should have said this before, VisitAble is working on a way to expand outside of Charlottesville, outside of Virginia, and to the rest of the nation, at least to start. And I think that being able to be involved and advocate through the certification process and being able to talk to business owners and hopefully this platform as well can be a thing that will be coming in the near future that can help with these concerns.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joe and Corey. I appreciate you guys being here with me today and kind of shedding light on this. And I would love to go ahead and have everybody visit VisitAble. It's at visitable.org. And it explains all about their certification process, also all about what Corey and Joe are doing in their community. And I can't wait to keep working with you all. And thank you so much, Empowered Spoonies, for being here today. And thank you for the questions. And this will be live on our Facebook, YouTube, and very soon Spotify as part of our podcast. We'll talk to you soon. Have a great, guys.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye.